the country was divided up by tribal areas. And that in the tribal areas, people had these altars, and this is how they sacrificed to God. And what was their life like in this time? First of all, there were no kings. There were these leaders called judges, shoftim, and you can see it in the book of Judges. And they were kind of flawed people. These leaders were not very good. Probably the best one was a woman, Deborah, who had the most integrity and was known as a judge. But there were a lot of them, Samson, Jephthah. I mean, they were not very good judges, but they were good military leaders. And so that was kind of what they were choosing them for at that time, because there was a lot of conflict in the land. People lived in scattered villages, and there were Canaanites, and there was pagan religion in the land as well. And for some reason, there's this idea that some of the Canaanites, or the Israelites who came back, whatever they are, they started to worship Yahweh, Adonai, as we say, as their primary God. Now, I read something very interesting, that the ancient Israelites were not really monotheists, according to these scholars. They were what you call henotheists. There was a concept called henotheism, 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 which means that they had a main God that they worshiped, but they still kind of worshiped lesser gods. And according to these scholars, when in the Ten Commandments it says, "You shall have no other gods before me," it means I'm first. There may be other gods, but no God before me. Not, and I always thought of it as in front of me or before, like facing me or whatever, but they're saying it means lifanai, actually before me, I'm number one, whether you have other gods or not. And there was this idea that they sort of evolved toward monotheism. It wasn't like really like in the Torah where Abraham, said there's one God and that was it. We actually know in the Torah, Rachel stole the household gods when she left to go back to the land, because I think they're household gods, fertility gods. And they also, these scholars say that people really worship, we say God of our fathers, Abraham, and our mothers, we added our mothers, but that there was an ancestral idea of family gods, the gods of our fathers. And that when the first king, Saul, and then David, and then Solomon, the first three kings, they made their family gods the God for the whole country. This idea. And let's just talk about that time, and then I'll show you when the one God concept evolved in ancient Israel. So I want to go back to how did they live? They lived in these stone, sort of two-story dwellings. Okay, Hannah, would you show the home? Like that. And we have another one too, where keep going. Yeah, so you could see that they lived upstairs, and below were their animals. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you can see their basic crockery, their dishes, and how they lived up there upstairs. And you can see there's a little blankets or skins to sleep in on the side. And then the next one, Hannah. And you see that there was always two stories, and they slept on the roof. Sometimes they slept outside when it was really hot. And this was a typical dwelling of an ancient Israelite. If you were more wealthy, you might have had a courtyard. You might have had some kind of polished stone floor or whatever. You might have had a fireplace, as opposed to a lot of women, they cooked outside over a little open fire. Everything to have like an indoor fire or an indoor fireplace was very, very elite. In every era, there's always like the modern accommodations that the women have that show they're rich or whatever. And so they lived like that, and show what they dressed like. Okay, so everyone in the beginning sort of wore these long robes, and these covers, they covered their hair and against the sun, and they slept in the covering, you know, their robe that was also their blanket. So a lot of times they slept under this thing that they wore all day. I don't know how often they washed their clothes. The women, you know, made all the clothing. They had to weave everything and then sew everything. So that is how they dressed for in these long robes for hundreds and hundreds of years. I don't think it really changed till the Babylonian exile, and then the Greek, when the Greeks took over and they started to adapt Greek clothing. So,
question.
Yes.
The picture that you showed of the home,
You can go back, Hannah. You want to? Yeah.
Is that actually existing? If we wanted to go see it,
Maybe it's probably a model or reconstruction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm sure you can. I'm sure there are ruins of homes and all kinds of things like that. So, okay, Hannah, you can go back. Just to everyone. So finally, after these pretty mediocre judges, the people wanted a king. They wanted a king like all the other nations around them. And the prophet at that time was Samuel. There were always seemed to be, so let me just say one thing before I do that, because I think it's interesting. What were the professions? Because one of them was scribe, which probably evolved into a prophet. The professions of the people at that time, you were either a priest, meaning you worked in sacrificial cult, and you would also teach people the ways of God and take care of any of the religious ceremonies, circumcision, probably weddings or whatever, any kind of religious thing came from the priest. You would go to the priest. You could be a scribe. That was an educated man who worked for the government. And this was in the time of the kings, probably the most. They kept records, wrote letters, and helped in collecting taxes. So the priests and the scribes, until the Babylonian exile, were probably the only literate people at that time. Later, more people became literate. You could be a soldier, a professional soldier, and, be in the army for the king. You could be a potter, as we saw, that would be a very lucrative profession because people needed pots for everything. You could be a fisherman, and there were lakes and the Sea of Galilee and whatever, and they lived by the Mediterranean Sea, and they went out in boats and they caught fish, and they sold the fish. You could be a farmer, which probably a farmer or a shepherd, I would think, probably both. And they grew wheat, barley, figs, grapes, olives, and they had wet winters there and dry summers. So they planted in the late fall to let the crops soak in the winter rain, and they harvested in early summer. So that were the professions. The women were mainly, taking care of the homes. However, when you think of they had to weave all the clothing and make all the clothing, cook all the food, make candles. So they had to learn to know how to make candles, have children. It was a lot of work. Later, actually, there's papyrus showing in the CE time, after the destruction of the temple, women actually did some business as well. They were more in business, but at this time they were at home. And yes, of course, a woman had to have children to be valued. And they loved all their children. They loved their daughters and their sons. The reason that people preferred sons, and even women did at that time, is because your daughter would always go and live with her husband's family. So you would lose your daughter. Though if you're living in the same tribe, she could be nearby. They cherished all their children, but there was this, knowledge that your daughter is going to leave, and marriage was starting at 13 or 14. So you loved your daughter, but she wasn't going to grow up with you and stay with you like your sons and his wives were. So that's kind of like the way they were living. So yes.
Do you know if they had like marketplaces where
they had outdoor marketplaces?
So did women maybe do that while the men were farming? The women would be selling the produce in the market?
It's possible. I'm sure widows were and young, but I think women were mainly at home. They would go shopping. They'd have to go shopping almost every day, you know, for fresh food because
No refrigeration.
no way to preserve the food. But I think, you know, the farmers and the shepherds and the fishermen, this is part of their work would be selling their produce and their products. They didn't just farm for themselves. And I imagine at some point there were even bakers, even though they don't mention it, and people didn't bake everything themselves. I just want to show you that they ate pita just like we do today. That was their bread, flat bread. They cooked it on an open fire. And they were mainly vegetarians and eating dairy because, and a little fish. So that, which is the way the Torah talks about it. We're supposed to be vegetarians. So then the first king was, let me go back to this because I mean, I have so many notes, was King Saul, and he was the king from, hold on. He was the king from 1020 BCE until 1000. So only for 20 years was King Saul. Then David, 1000 to 961. So that's like 39 years he was king. And, you know, you could go into their all kinds of rivalries and wars and fights and whatever between Saul and David. But David, you know, the rabbis say this is the reason he did not build the temple, the main temple in Jerusalem, because he had caused so much bloodshed and fought in so many wars. It was his son Solomon, and you know the Hebrew name of Solomon is Shlomo, which comes from Shalom. So he was a peaceful, supposedly king, though. He had a lot of problems. We always talk about Solomon being so wise, but he was a bit grandiose, to be honest with you. First of all, he had hundreds of wives. They say 1,000 wives. And his favorite wife was and of course the wives were treaties. You made treaties with different nations by marrying their daughters. Okay. So his favorite wife was Pharaoh's daughter from Egypt, who they had a treaty with. And he allowed her actually to build a palace and to worship her gods in Jerusalem. By the way, King David is the one who found Jerusalem and established it as the capital. Before then, it was not the capital. King David established Jerusalem as the capital. But he did build this magnificent temple. And Hannah, show us a picture of the temple, please. Yes, next. This is not the temple. Hannah, are you there?
Sorry, just a second.
No. Keep
know,
going
I know.
down.
That's a house in Topanga.
There.
There you go.
Okay, so this is the model of the temple, the first temple. You can see that, see the walls and how all the different courtyards, and this was the inner courtyard, and this was in Jerusalem. And in the high building in the middle there, that was the Holy of Holies, where the ark was and where the high priest only went in once a year on Yom Kippur. Now the high priest had a very special costume. Please show the costume, Hannah. And you can see this is described in the Torah. It has this breastplate with these 12 jewels, which supposedly would light up and give him messages from God. You can see the altar there and his beautiful clothing. And then on Yom Kippur, show us the next one of him in the Holy of Holies. And there's the Ark of the Covenant with the two cherubim facing each other, and he's lighting, adding something in there to make smoke. And this is only on Yom Kippur. So this was a huge ritual, and, it was considered God's dwelling place. In Hebrew, it's called Beit HaMikdash, the house of the holiness, with the Holy of Holies in it. And there was this idea that God basically lived in, above, or within, or this was his dwelling place, that God's presence was within or around or above the temple. Okay, Hannah, you can take that out. the thing about Solomon that wasn't so pleasant is in order to build the temple, he had forced labor. And every month, a different tribe had to come, whether they liked it or not, and the men had to come and work on the temple. And it was pretty, they didn't get much money or anything. And he, said that was their obligation. When he died, his son that inherited from him was named Rehoboam. I'm looking for the name exactly because yes, it was his son.
Rehoboam and Jehoram.
Yeah, Jeroboam. But Rehoboam was his son, and the people came to him and they said, and the elders and said, if you will be more lenient and kinder to us than your father, we will be your loyal subjects. Now, I always imagine him as a spoiled prince who had hundreds of brothers, royal princes from all these women. And, he was the prince of the princes. And he came back, and I think he was very full of himself and said, no, I'm going to be harder, even more cruel, more demanding than my father. Claudia, did you want to ask something? Did you have your hand? Oh, you have your little hand up.
Me?
Yeah, it's an icon.
Yeah, I just was wondering
Talia, go ahead. Go ahead, Talia.
When you showed, hi everyone, when you showed the picture of the temple with the holiest of holy places, they only went in for Yom Kippur.
Right.
Was that one for each?
It was the only one in Jerusalem. It was the central place.
So it reminds me a little bit of that when we studied with Saba, Professor or Dr. Saba, about what's it called? The Kaaba in Mecca?
Yeah.
It sounds like that kind of a little bit.
Except the Kaaba, I don't think anybody ever went in. They walked around it, I know, and stuff. There was a stone or something. But this was actually a dwelling where people came, they brought their sacrifices. There was a woman's court, then there was an inner court, and then a further inner court. It was a very busy place. Also in the temple, there were orchestras, choirs, all the holidays were celebrated in quite an elaborate way. And the three holidays of Sukkot, Pesach, Passover, and Shavuot were called the Shalosh Regalim, the three
pilgrimages.
Yeah, what's the word?
Pilgrimages.
What?
Traveling.
Traveling, but there's
Pilgrim
a word.
holidays.
Pilgrimage holidays, where people went to Jerusalem, thousands of people, to sacrifice, to bring their first fruits, to celebrate. I always think of the smell. All those animals and all that burning. What did Jerusalem smell like? I don't know. So, and this went on so when the prince Rehoboam said this, 10 of the tribes rebelled and said, fine, we're going to start our own country. And they left. And the country split into two kingdoms. One was called the Kingdom of Israel, and that had 10 tribes. And one was called the Kingdom of Judah, and that had 2 tribes, 2 or 3, depending, they say, maybe Simon's, but I don't, it was Benjamin and Judah. And that was where Jerusalem was, in Judah. And they had separate kings, and then they built a separate sacrificial palace or whatever that we don't, they had a separate place for sacrifices, separate priests, separate everything, but it was the same Jews. They were all Jews, or we weren't Jews, they were Israelites, but they all had the same, belief system. But they, it was like the Civil War. If it had succeeded, there would have been the South and the North. But the North, the one that was bigger and more powerful, the one that we don't have anymore. And then I'll tell you the exact date. Hold on. I can't remember the exact date. What is it? Oh my God. It's 7.
Are you looking for the destruction? 722 or 7?
It was 7. No, 9.
722. The Syrians.
Yeah, the Syrians, right. The Syrians came in 722, right. So the Assyrians to the north invaded and basically conquered northern Israel. And at that time, a lot of Israelites from the north fled to Judah, and they brought with them this stronger idea of monotheism and pieces of the Torah with them. And things started now to consolidate in the south, which is Judah. Yes.
When was the Babylonian exile? I
That's
thought it was
586.
It's
586.
We're getting there. 722 was Assyria. And now, if you've heard of the 10 lost tribes,
right.
these are the 10 lost tribes from this time. That's when they disappeared. They were taken off into exile. And there was just one kingdom now, Judah. And slowly they were starting to think of God, Adonai, as being the God, and that there was a treaty that if we follow the teachings of this one God, he would protect the people in the land. He dwelled there, you know, he had the temple there and whatever. So in 586, when Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar from Babylonia invaded. Now, Babylonia is Iraq, so it's not that far away, invaded and destroyed the temple and took the people into exile. This was like a spiritual crisis, like a nervous breakdown for the people emotionally. And Hannah, do you have the picture of the exile?
Yep.
Of the destruction? So this is just like a rendering of what it looked like. You can see the temples on fire. And they took all these people in. If you read the book of Lamentations, which is in the Ketuvim, there's poetry about this. This is where they said, if I forget Jerusalem, let my right hand, you know, cleave and stop working. And how we cried by the rivers of Babylon because we were destroyed and taken. So all these people were taken into exile to Babylonia. Okay.
Not all the people.
No, the elite.
Only the elite.
The elite.
Only the educated, only the ones who could potentially create a society again that could be rebellious.
Right, exactly. All the educated elite, the poor, the very poor stayed there. You know, they didn't need the peasants. Okay, Hannah, you can go back. And Lori, did you raise your hand? Did you have a question? Lori? No. Okay. So does anybody have any questions so far about anything?
You know, the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians is thought to be a punishment for not heeding the prophets.
I know. Stop. Wait a second. Just a second. I know that. I want it because this is now how Judaism changes again in philosophically. But Susan, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted, when we're through with this, would you go back with the Holy of Holies and explain the outer courtyards? When we're through with all of the,
Sure.
The image was very good.
Oh, okay. You can look up on the internet and there's tons of images and there's.
Yeah, I guess the explanation. I don't want to stop you from here because
Okay.
we're moving on.
So, okay.
Susan,
Lori,
what year was this? What year was the temple destroyed again? I'm trying to check.
586.
Finally.
586.
She's not at
BCE.
70 yet.
No.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay. Just one. Yeah, Miriam.
I've had my hand up for a while. I just want to clarify one question. Not all were taken to Babylonia as prisoners or as exiles. Some remained in Judah.
Yes.
Correct? Okay. Now, we know what happened to those who were taken to Babylonia. We know they were freed later on by Cyrus and they were allowed to go back to Jerusalem.
Wait.
But what happened to the remaining ones that stayed? Where were they? In Judah? Those
Okay. What happened to them? They intermarried a lot with the other nations, the Sumerians, the Moabites. They intermarried and they, you know, lived within the other kingdoms. That's what happened because and I'll tell you about that in a second,
Okay.
One second, Pina. I just want to get to this.
They
Yeah.
became Americans.
When they got to Babylonia, this was a huge crisis, a psychological crisis, because people had felt God's house was burned down. God had abandoned them. God was gone. There was no place for God to be. Also, there was this idea that every country had their own gods. They were in another country. God, if he was anywhere, was still in Judah, but he had nowhere to live. So God had abandoned them. So they felt completely alone. You know, you lived your life, you know, to worship God, to follow God, and now there were no gods. And so they had to rethink it. And as Jeff alluded to, this was the beginning of it. The men of the Great Assembly, because as we said, these were the elite, the intellectuals, the rabbis, the scholars, they said no. First of all, two new ideas came. One is that this is a punishment and that we can atone and bring God back. And also that God is not just in the land of Judah, God is everywhere. So this was a huge idea, or our God is everywhere, and our God, we can atone and connect with him. However, people only knew how to connect with God through sacrifice. They said, how do we connect? And this was the beginning, really, of formalized prayer. We'll talk to God. We'll sing to God. We sang psalms in the temple. We sang. Now that was the special Levite choirs. We will sing. We will pray to God. So this was a new idea. What will we pray? What do we say? They didn't know what to say. And this is when the Amidah was written. The first prayer is, people know it's as the Amidah, the standing prayer. It's also called Ha-Tefillah, the prayer, because this was the first formalized prayer, was the Amidah. And it was also called the Shemona Esrei, which means the 18, because within it were 18 requests for God to bless them and watch over them, protect us from our enemies, give us peace, return us to our land. They put those requests in the Amidah, starting it again with the blessings of our fathers, the God of our fathers, because they still had this idea of the familial God, or the national God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Protect us, bless us. And so, one more second, Penina. And where would they pray for this? Synagogues were created in Babylonia, and that's where the first synagogues happened. And the word in Hebrew is Beit Knesset, which really means just house of gathering. So they gathered there probably for support groups, for business, for marriages, and for prayer. Penina.
Okay, the book of Esther,
yes,
is a very good picture of not exactly of what was going on within the Jewish community in Babylonia.
But that was in Persia.
That was in
Okay,
Persia.
but I think it was
Similar.
Right. There is a lot of simulation to the point where their names even were given of goddesses and gods. Mordechai, is the name of a Babylonian god.
Right.
Ishtar, Esther, was a goddess.
Right.
So that's just to show.
So they assimilated to some degree. Jeff, did you want to say something?
What's interesting about this period with the Babylonian exile is it's one of the only examples when an entire people are subsequently freed. And we don't have a real understanding as to why the king and the community of Babylonia allowed these hostages, so to speak, to return to their country.
Well,
and to be reestablish the temple.
Okay,
the greatest effort.
But that's not what happened. Okay, so let's just wait a minute.
Okay.
I just want to show you a picture, Hannah, of Babylonian, homes or gardens or whatever, because this I think is interesting. Hannah, show the picture, the next one. Okay, it was beautiful.
Yeah.
much more beautiful than Judah. These are two different photos. Very sophisticated, very elegant. Look at these gardens. And this is like a Babylonian, I don't know, house or mansion or meeting place or even a temple. Okay, Hannah, you can take it off. No, take it off. And so what happened was, it wasn't that the Babylonians let them go back. They were conquered by Persia, which is Iran today. And Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, thought, well, I can keep them here. And then I have this piece of this country that, you know, is part of my booty of my conquest, or I can send them back to rebuild and get taxes.
Right.
They would pay tribute and taxes. So it made more sense. Now, starting in Babylonia, okay, so first of all, some Jews did not go back. They liked it there. They didn't want to leave, and they stayed there. And the last, quote unquote, Babylonian Jews to leave there was in 1950, when Israel was established. It was in Iraq. There were still Jews there from the Babylonian exile. They were living with Muslims. They spoke Aramaic and Arabic, and they practiced biblical Judaism to some degree, you know, or early rabbinic Judaism. And only when Israel, won their 48 war did Iraq kick them out, and they were sent to Israel in 1950. So they stayed there for 2,500 years, basically. And the Babylonian Talmud, there was a whole school there of scholars. That is the Talmud that we use the most, not the Jerusalem Talmud. We prefer the Babylonian Talmud. Is more scholarly, more erudite, more clear, more beautifully written. So, but then he said you could go back, and a lot of them went back. And one of the leaders who went back with them was I guess he was part of the government, or he worked for the king, but he was going to be kind of a governor. His name was Ezra. And he went back. And this is when the Torah, for the first time, was kind of put together. I think maybe some of it was done in Babylonia, because he brought back, before then, the scribes some had the book of Genesis, some had the book of Leviticus. They had the different books. The people didn't really read them. They were told what to do. But when they got back, Ezra sort of established a whole new way of thinking, and he gathered all the people. So he did one great thing and one kind of upsetting thing. The great thing was he gathered all the people, kind of like today, Taya says, and he read the whole Torah to the people. Some synagogues were established because people loved this idea of a Beit Knesset, of a meeting place. And the temple was still, they had to rebuild the temple, which took, a long time. But in the meantime, they started to establish these synagogues there. But he also gathered all the Jews who had remained there, and he insisted that they divorce their non-Jewish wives and send them away with their non-Jewish children. And it was, a huge thing. And he said, no, we're going to follow the Torah. And at this point, Adonai, God, they felt, because they did worship other gods a little bit, that could not happen. That was the reason for the Babylonian destruction, that we had to just pray to Adonai. He is the God. And we can't have any intermarriage. We can't have anyone in the family who's worshiping other gods. So this was a huge trauma. And I don't know if you'll like this, Penina, but some scholars say that the book of Esther not the book of Esther, the book of Ruth, is a story to protest that idea, because Moabite women were sent away, and Ruth was the ultimate fantastic convert. She was a Moabite, we hold her up and she was the great grandmother of King David. That this story was written during that time to protest this banishment of non-Jewish wives and to show how great non-Jewish wives could be. And yes, Pnina?
I don't disagree with you.
Okay, okay.
About the time that the book of Ruth was written. That might be an encouragement for getting people to allow to join in. But there is two things also that I was thinking about when they came to Jerusalem. There was a lot of, I would say, snobism when they were allowed to build the first temple. Because
Snobism, yeah.
They started making lists of who is allowed to worship and who is allowed into the temple,
right.
and who would be this and who would be that. And even though we called him Ezra Sofer, who is supposed to be a writer of history or establisher of history, there was a lot of stuff going on there that was not right. I had to write a paper.
Oh yeah, there was a lot of pagan worship in the temple.
And also there wasn't an acceptance of everybody that really taught himself to be to belong. And that was not a very good thing. That's why it took them for so long to build it.
To build the second temple.
And also when it came to Cyrus believed that he should be on good terms with all the gods. That was one thing one reason why he allowed them to go back and build the temple, because he did it with all the rest of the people that had their own gods in his country. He sent them because he wanted to be on good terms with all the gods.
That's a great idea. Thank you. Miriam.
Yes, I always learned or thought that Ezra and Nehemiah together did very great things. But every Monday and Thursday, at the shuk, they gathered all the people and they read the Torah together, which is where we get the Yiddish expression, Monday and Donnerstag, Monday and Thursday. And those are also the days that you can take out the Torah and get bar mitzvah, etc.
Yes.
So this is new to me, Susan.
No,
that he sent away the children, but the children, weren't they Jewish children?
He sent away the women and children, and that's in the book of Ezra. You can take a look; it's in there.
Really, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So after that, there was a time when they were under the Persian rule,
and they had to report to him. They had to report to Cyrus all the time.
Everything, and send taxes. But then Alexander the Great came on the scene in 300 and let's see.
323.
323, and he conquered the whole world practically, including Judah or Judea, it was starting to be called. And he brought in sort of the Greek. It started to become a little more modern, a little more worldly. Before Babylon, they kind of lived in their own little world with their own beliefs and whatever, sort of a provincial country. Babylonia expanded them and made them more sophisticated, the ones who were there, the ones who came back. And now the Greeks, with their culture, came into the land, and we see they had gymnasiums, they had amphitheaters, and some of the youth really started dressing like the Greeks and worshiping the body, which is a big thing with Greece, which had the establishment all up in arms about it. I mean, they used to have marathon races naked. That was a thing that the Greeks did. And there's, I've read that some of the young Judean boys tried to have their circumcisions undone because it was a desecration of the body, and the body was your temple, so to speak, of the gods. So there was this whole new idea where Judaism remained, but it started to become more sophisticated and more international. And finally, in 166, Alexander the Great died, and 3 of his generals inherited
divided the kingdoms.
Yeah, they divided the kingdoms, and the Judea went under the Seleucid kings, which is King Antiochus Seleucus was the general, and his descendants. And this is the Hanukkah story, part of the Hanukkah story. Because the part we know is that, he was imposing Greek religion on the people and, forcing sacrifices of unkosher animals in the temple. And he tried, but before then, by the way, it was this time from Ezra, through the Greeks, that Shabbat became more important, Torah study, people became more literate. They found actually some tablets from a quartermaster in the army in ancient Israel, writing to another quartermaster saying we need more wine and oil and wheat. But the thing is, it was like in 400 BCE, he could write. He was literate. So we used to think that only the elite were literate, but after they returned and coming from Babylonia, the idea of education and literacy spread to even the middle classes, that people, and we were probably as a people, one of the first to have the common man be able to read in the world, as opposed to just the elite. Yes, Nina.
They brought with them something that we in Israel use till today, which is the calendar, the Jewish calendar. And not only that they brought it and we use it till today, but the names of some of the months in Hebrew are names of Babylonian goddesses, gods.
That's right.
Tishritum was the goddess of fertility. And the first month of the Jewish calendar is Tishrei.
Right.
Okay. Then Tammuz was a Babylonian god.
That's right. You're right.
Okay. That's not all of it. Okay. We have a few of them that showed you. Yeah. And we kept them out of respect to their culture and their innovation, to realize how the circle of the sun and the moon interact with the stars and all this stuff to create these differences in the month, to adjust it. So the holidays will always fall in the same time. Otherwise, it would be like a Chinese calendar that you have the, holidays fall one time in the winter and the same holiday one time will fall in another time.
Our calendar, the Julian calendar, is also for the Roman gods. March is Mars, July is, Julius Caesar. Actually, they did some, and August is Augustus Caesar, who they considered gods. So you're right. They brought the calendar back as well. But what I wanted to say is part of the rebellion was against the Syrian Greeks, the Seleucids, but part of it was the Zealots, or the religious Jews, were also sort of fighting against what we would call today the Reformed Jews. The Hellenized Jews, the ones who had become very in love with the Greek culture, they felt that they were polluting the religion, polluting the country, and so there was kind of a battle between them as well. However, I found a very interesting picture of Judah Maccabee that I was drawing, Hannah.
Yep.
Which shows kind of like the transition and how the culture had affected them. This is Mattathiyahu blessing his sons. He's dressed in the old ancient Israelite way. His sons are dressed like Greek soldiers and Roman soldiers too. But they've got the short tunics and the breastplates, and they have become, even though they're still religious, quote unquote, or zealots, they have been modernized by Greek culture. So you see the contrast between the two, and this is kind of the transition. I thought that was very interesting. I wanted to show that to you.
One of the great unions between the Greeks and the Jews at that time is the fact that they absolutely supported, as you've mentioned indirectly, education and knowledge and the ability to seek it out, and allowed different areas of study to develop within the land. And in essence, we almost have to thank them for supporting the educational bent of the Israelites at the time.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay, Hannah, thank you. We're done with that. So for a brief time, but I really think it was Ezra and Nehemiah who, even before the Greeks, were already teaching, saying people should study Torah and people should read, and they started educating children. And I think compulsory teaching of your children to read started in like 200 BCE for your sons, but daughters were taught, but they didn't need to be taught like your sons. But education, and we already have it in the book of Deuteronomy, you shall teach your children. So there was this very ancient ethic of learning and education. After the Maccabees just ruled for a short time, and then Judea was conquered by the Romans. And the Romans came in and they built a lot of, if you've been to Tiberias, if you've been to Caesarea, you see that they built amphitheaters. They then brought in the Roman culture on top of the Greek culture. And at this point, Judeans were also, now in trade and traveling to other countries. They were going to Italy, they were going to Greece, they were going to Iran, and they were becoming more cosmopolitan and more worldly. And I feel like the ancient Israelite culture kind of stops at this point and becomes more, they're not so ancient, they're more, I don't know what we would call it, but this time of mingling and mixing and learning from all different countries that were coming, because Judea, Israel, is in the crossroads really of so many cultures. There's Egypt in the south, there's Lebanon and Syria and Babylonia in the north, and then across the Mediterranean, you've got Greece, you've got Italy. And so with the trade and everything, it's when they start to expand, and their minds, their foods, their behaviors, everything at that time. So I feel like that's kind of the end of the ancient Israelite history. And then we have another one. So Phyllis, do you have a hand up? Phyllis or Warren? No. Okay. Anybody else before I go? Panina, I know Panina, but I want to just give anyone else a chance who has a question or a comment. Anything that you'd like to know deeper?
Yes, deeper.
Yes, Susan.
Can you give a more? Can you give some more deeper? More deeper. That's right. A deeper class in this. I mean, sometimes
this could be a whole course. Yeah.
Periods. Yes. I mean, it could be. You were giving an outline here, which was great, and I love the images. That really brings it. But if you could next sessions coming up.
Well, right now we're doing, an overview. So the next one is medieval.
Yeah, but I mean, even.
in the future. Yeah, I think I would invite a real historian or archaeological historian to talk deeper, because I'm not a scholar in this. I mean, I only know, I've studied, I've read, but I mean, I don't know. I love it. I think it's really interesting. Yeah, it's very interesting.
And all of that, and Omri and that.
Okay.
You know what's interesting?
Wait, 1 second. Ruth, did you want to say something?
Yes, I had my hand up.
Wait, just a second. Ruth, did you have your hand up? Oh, no, you're not. Okay, Miriam.
I want you to wait till the end of the session. First of all, to thank you so much. It was wonderful. And secondly, I want to share a thought that occurred to me, and even though it's not on the subject. Today is Wednesday, and it's a very special Wednesday for me. I'm excited about it. I want to share that with you. We are exactly halfway between finishing the very last chapter of Deuteronomy and starting Wilshire. And to me, I am so grateful to be here. I mean that with huge gratitude. I am so happy to be here among my Wilshire Boulevard friends, to be here with Rabbi Susan, whom I extol, and to share a special feeling that perhaps we can all have for a moment. For me, it's very emotional, because this Shabbat morning that's coming, that we're here, that Shehachayanu, God has let us be here all together. All the Jews all over the world, wherever Jews exist, We'll all be reading the beginning of Bereshit.
Thank you. Thank you,
And
Miriam.
I will personally open the Bible this Shabbat morning, and I don't do that often. I will do it and open to the first chapter of Bereshit
Thank you,
and
Miriam.
read the text. And I propose that we all do that.
Thank you,
I don't need to
Miriam.
tell anybody what to do.
Okay. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tanina?
Okay, now, people think that the Greeks, the Romans, why were they in Israel to begin with? The target was never really Israel. The target was Egypt. It started with Alexander the Great, who divided it among his two Talmai and Seleucus, or whatever you want to call them. One of them was in charge of Egypt. One of them was in charge of the north of Israel and that area. The idea that there was rivalry and there was jealousy.
Was rivalry.
And Egypt was always the target. During the Roman Empire, it was the same thing, because Egypt was the gate to Africa.
Right, and it was very rich.
Very rich with natural resources, the ivory that we know, the spices and this and that, perfumes, whatever it is. But Egypt was always the target. We were caught in the middle.
That's
The
right.
reason was that they needed somebody to pay those marching armies, to house them, to feed them, to dress them, so they can continue their journey to Egypt, to get
Right.
Egypt. The Jews were taxed to support those armies. That's why the rebellion actually started.
Right.
It wasn't that they had
Taxes.
anything against us. We were just happened to be on their way in a bridge.
We were just a
And
resource for them
it.
to suck dry and use
Exactly.
for their own. They really had no respect for other cultures. And I'll just end on this. The little Judea was the first country or people to rebel against the Roman Empire, which was like shocking.
Yeah.
And they were, very upset because it could inspire other places, because you have to realize the Roman Empire went all the way to England and Ireland,
Right.
all the way almost to, India or Persia or something. So it was huge, but it's one after one. So I know we could keep going, but I want to stop
That's not
now.
all of it. I'm not done. The Greeks actually lost for the Maccabees because they started to get involved in tackles with the Romans.
Right.
That was the luck of the Jews at the time of the Maccabees, that the Greeks were started to be more scattered, fighting the Romans started to arise and become very strong.
Right. So they weren't as strong.
It's a part of history.
Thank you so much. Nice
Okay.
to talk to everyone. Next
Bye-bye.
week will be medieval history, and it will be actually Dr. Leah Hockman, who's a great historian, is going to do that. I invited her to teach that, so I'll be here to hear her as well. I'm sure it'll be really interesting.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone, and I'll
Thank
see
you.
you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
It was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.